The great hall of the Galactic Council was filled with noise as voices from hundreds of alien worlds echoed against the high metal walls, while light from the twin suns above the city shone through the crystal dome and danced over the long tables, where delegates sat in groups of color and species, but one table near the center was quiet, where the humans sat still listening and watching as the argument continued, and their patience slowly faded because these talks had been going on for weeks, and nothing good had come from them, and the air was full of tension that anyone could feel. Ambassador Daniel Cross looked tired but calm, while he listened to another alien speaker insult humanity again, saying that humans were too violent to be trusted, and that the Terran Union should accept stricter control if they wanted to stay part of the Council. And his voice was full of arrogance, as if he was talking to a child, while Daniel's face showed no emotion. But deep inside he felt a quiet anger growing like a storm that was waiting to break. Beside him sat Captain Laura Bennett, who had been silent for most of the talks, but her hands were tight around the data pad she carried, and her jaw was clenched because she could not believe how they were being treated after everything humanity had done to help the galaxy survive wars and plagues and disasters, and still the Council saw them as a problem, rather than partners, but she said nothing because Daniel had told her to let him handle the words. Across the chamber, Councillor Varex of the Velthar Confederacy stood tall and proud, and his four eyes glowed with amusement as he spoke about how dangerous humans were and how they needed supervision, and he pointed a long finger toward the human table. While many other delegates nodded in agreement and others stayed silent, not wanting to get involved because they knew how powerful humans had become. But they feared the idea of them standing alone without the Council's control, and so they stayed quiet. Daniel waited until the noise settled before he stood and looked around the room, and his calm voice filled the hall, as he said that humanity had always come to the Council in good faith and had followed every rule and shared their science and medicine and soldiers in wars that were not even their own. But still they were being treated like children who needed to be told what to do, and that was something no free world would accept forever. And for a moment the room went silent because the way he spoke was quiet but full of strength and meaning. Varex laughed and said that humans had always been dramatic, and that they should be grateful that the Council even allowed them to have a seat at the table, and that without the Council's protection, humanity would have fallen long ago. But Daniel did not answer because he knew that was a lie, and so did many others in the room who looked away in discomfort, but said nothing because the balance of power in the Council had always been built on fear and pride, not on truth. Laura wanted to speak, but Daniel raised his hand slightly to stop her, and then he turned to the central screen that showed the banner of the Council and said that if peace meant bending and breaking until nothing of what they were remained, then maybe peace was not what they wanted anymore, and his voice was calm and steady, and every word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, and when he finished speaking, the silence that followed was heavy and sharp. Some aliens tried to speak, but their words faded as the human delegation stood together and began to gather their things, and for the first time in the history of the Council, a member species walked away from the table in the middle of a session, without asking for permission or offering apology, and their footsteps echoed in the hall as they moved toward the exit, and the sound of those footsteps felt like thunder in the quiet room. Captain Bennett walked beside Daniel and said quietly that the Council thought humans were bluffing, and Daniel answered softly that they would soon learn what it meant when humanity said enough, and he did not look back as the heavy doors closed behind them, leaving the rest of the Council in confusion and anger and a little bit of fear, because no one had ever dared to walk away before. Outside the chamber, the great city of Valora stretched under the stars, filled with shining towers and air traffic from thousands of worlds, and yet in that moment it felt smaller to the humans who stood together looking up at the endless sky that now felt like home. And Laura looked at the stars and said that maybe it was time to stop asking for a seat at someone else's table and build their own, and Daniel nodded slowly, because deep down he knew she was right. The next few hours were a blur of motion as human envoys left the capital world, and their ships began to depart from every major station and trade port under the Council's control, and messages were sent to every Terran colony to prepare for full withdrawal from all Council relations, and even though some other species tried to talk them out of it, there was no turning back, because the decision had already been made in that moment inside the chamber, when Daniel stood up and said that simple sentence. The council called an emergency meeting to discuss what had happened, and Varric shouted that humans were reckless and dangerous, and that their departure should be treated as a threat. But others were not so sure, and some said that maybe the council had gone too far in trying to control them, and maybe it would have been better to treat them as equals, but no one wanted to admit fault. So they blamed each other instead, while the humans quietly left the galaxy's core and disappeared beyond known borders. In the days that followed, news channels across thousands of worlds showed images of Terran ships leaving stations and ambassadors handing back diplomatic seals, while the anchors spoke about how humanity had always been unpredictable and proud. But most of them said the same thing, that it would only be a matter of time before humans came back asking for help, because they could not survive alone. But no one really believed that deep down, because history had shown that when humans were pushed, they did not break, they adapted. Daniel watched the news from his transport ship as it moved away from the capital system, and he felt a strange calm come over him, because he knew what came next would not be easy, but it would be theirs. And for the first time in years, he felt free of the endless arguments and disrespect that had filled those meetings, and he thought about all the scientists and workers and soldiers back home who had been waiting for a chance to move forward without being told what they could and could not do, and he smiled slightly at the thought. Laura stood near the window watching the stars stretch into lines as the ship entered slipspace, and she said quietly that the council had never really understood humans. And Daniel agreed, saying that they thought peace was something given, not something earned, and that now they would learn what it meant when humans decided to make their own peace. And she nodded, knowing that what they were leaving behind was not peace but control, disguised as it, and that what they were heading toward was uncertain but full of possibility. Far behind them on the capital world, the council was already sending out messages demanding that the humans return to talks and threatening trade bans if they did not. But none of the messages received an answer, and one by one, the communication channels with Earth and the colonies went silent, leaving only static where once there had been conversation, and it was in that silence that many realized something had changed forever, though few could admit it aloud. As the Terran fleet moved farther from the Council's reach, the humans aboard felt a strange unity forming between them, not built by the Council's laws, but by something older and stronger that came from shared struggle and hope. And they did not know what the future would bring, but they knew one thing for certain: they would face it together as one people, free to choose their own path across the stars. The departure of the Terran ships became the most talked about event in the galaxy, because no one had ever seen a species turn away from the Galactic Council so suddenly and with such quiet confidence, and while the media and governments argued about what it meant, the humans themselves simply disappeared from the main networks and their worlds closed communication gates, as if the rest of the galaxy no longer existed for them, and soon only silence remained where once there had been constant messages, trade, and travel. In the weeks that followed, many smaller species who had relied on Terran technology began to realize how much they had depended on human designs, because ships that used Terran engine cores began to break down, and medical stations that used Terran biogels found their supplies running out and no replacements came. And even the Council fleets had to admit that a large part of their systems were built on technology that had come from Earth, and now, without permission or support, those systems began to fail slowly, one after another. On Earth, things were different, because for the first time in generations, the people of the Terran Union were united by one purpose, and that was to stand on their own, without the Council watching over them, and the factories and shipyards that had once produced goods for trade with other worlds now began to build for themselves in the skies above Earth and Mars, filled with the shapes of new ships, sleek and dark, with designs never shared with outsiders, and the workers spoke with pride about building something only for humanity. Ambassador Daniel Cross returned to Earth, and when he stood before the Terran Assembly, he was met with silence that soon turned into long applause, because everyone knew what he had done and what it meant. And even though many feared what would come next, they respected him for standing up for their dignity, and when he spoke, he did not promise peace or safety, but only that humanity would never again ask for permission to exist, and that from this day onward, the stars would be theirs to explore as free beings. Captain Laura Bennett had been given command of one of the new fleets called the Horizon Line, and her task was to oversee the protection of Terran space, and though it was meant to be a defensive role, she knew deep down that one day it might mean more because the council would not simply let humans go without trying to bring them back under control. And for that reason, she trained her crews harder than ever before, preparing them for anything that might come from beyond their borders. In the council chambers far across the stars, the mood had changed from anger to confusion, and then to worry because no one had heard anything from the humans in almost a month, and trade numbers were falling, and supply chains were breaking, and even communication satellites were beginning to fail, because so many of them had been designed by human engineers, and no one else fully understood how to repair them. And when the truth of that reached the council floor, many delegates began to panic. Councillor Varix insisted that the council should send a fleet to the Terran border to demand answers, but others warned that such an action could be seen as a declaration of war, and that perhaps it was better to wait for the humans to calm down and come back. But weeks turned into months and nothing changed, and in that silence, the galaxy began to feel the weight of what it had lost, because the humans had not just been another species, they had been builders, traders, and explorers whose energy had touched every corner of known space. One day, Commander Elias Grant, who had once served in the Joint Defense Force before the split, received a report that made him uneasy, because deep in the far rim beyond the mapped routes, strange energy readings had been detected, and the patterns did not match any known technology, and the power levels were massive, far beyond what any council world could produce. And some of the readings showed movement, as if large fleets were traveling through uncharted sectors, and Elias knew at once that this was not random. He took the report to Varix, but the counselor laughed and said it was human propaganda, meant to make the council afraid, and that they were probably just building a few stations to look strong. But Elias was not convinced, and he began to quietly gather more data from explorers and smugglers who worked near the border, and their stories all said the same thing, that there were new stations being built on the edge of Terran space, large enough to be seen from light years away and guarded by ships no one recognized. Meanwhile, on Mars, Captain Bennett walked through the hangar of her new flagship, a massive vessel named the Unity, and it was unlike any ship built before because it used a new drive based on human research that had never been shared with the Council. And the engineers told her that it could cross distances the Council's best ships could not, and that its armor could withstand any known weapon. And when she saw it, she felt a mix of pride and fear, because it meant that humanity was no longer simply catching up to others but moving beyond them. Daniel Cross visited the Mars shipyards one evening to see the progress, and as he stood on the viewing platform looking at the great ships rising from the dry docks, he thought about the years they had spent trying to earn respect from a council that had never seen them as equals, and he realized that walking away had not been an end but a beginning. And he told Laura that once they were strong enough they would reach out again, but on their own terms, not as subjects, but as equals. And she agreed, knowing that day would come sooner than anyone expected. Months later, the first Terran exploration fleets left for the outer sectors, places the Council had declared too dangerous or too remote for colonization, and while the Council had used fear to keep others from going there, the humans saw only opportunity, and they began to build new worlds in silence, far from prying eyes, and their scientists discovered resources and technologies that had been hidden in those regions for ages, and what they found changed everything about what was possible. Back in the council chambers, Varix grew frustrated as reports came in about economic collapse in outer colonies that depended on Terran support, and he blamed the humans for abandoning them, but other counselors began to question whether it was the council's arrogance that had driven them away, and even some old allies of Varix began to turn against him, saying that it was his constant insults that had provoked the final break. And soon the council was divided with no clear direction or unity. As the galaxy argued over who was to blame, the humans continued to grow quietly. And while the council fought over resources, the Terran Union built new shipyards and research colonies near the galactic rim, and people began to speak of something called the Horizon Expansion, a movement that aimed to settle 100 new worlds in 10 years. And no one outside the Union knew how large it had already become because no communication left their territory, and no one dared to cross their borders to find out. Commander Elias Grant, who had always respected the humans, began to feel uneasy as he watched these changes from afar, because he knew the Council was not ready for what might happen if humanity decided to return, and he tried to warn them, but his words fell on deaf ears, and he could only watch as the galaxy grew more fragile each day, while the humans grew stronger in silence and secrecy, beyond the reach of anyone else. On Earth, the nights were filled with the glow of new launch towers, and the skies above were streaked with light from ships rising toward the stars, and people spoke with hope again because they no longer felt small or limited, and children in schools learned about the first explorers who would soon travel to places no council map had ever shown, and the sense of purpose that had once been lost had returned stronger than ever before. Daniel Cross stood on a balcony overlooking the ocean near his home, and he thought about the council and how they must now be realizing what they had lost, and he felt no anger, only a quiet understanding, because humanity had tried to make peace. But peace without respect was only a cage, and now that cage was gone and before him stretched a horizon without end filled with stars waiting to be claimed by free hands. Months turned into years, and the silence of humanity became something that the Galactic Council could no longer ignore, because their absence was beginning to hurt everything from trade to research to defense, and even the smallest colonies at the edges of Council space started to feel the effect of not having human ships bringing supplies or technology, and the once proud capital worlds that had laughed when the humans walked away were now facing shortages and growing fear. Counselor Varix continued to say that humans would return soon, and that they were too dependent on the galaxy to survive alone. But the truth was becoming clear even to his own allies that humanity had not only survived, they were thriving in the far rim where no council control existed, and reports from traders and explorers who dared to go near those borders spoke of massive stations bright as cities and fleets of ships that moved like shadows through the stars, and every time someone asked what they had seen, they only said one thing, that the humans were building something vast. Commander Elias Grant sat in the observation deck of a council defense station near the rim, reading the latest reports, and what he saw made him uneasy, because the numbers showed that the humans were expanding faster than any species had in history, and no one knew how many ships they now had or what their real power was. And though he tried to convince the council to send a diplomatic team instead of warships, no one listened, because fear had already begun to guide every decision they made. On Earth, the people had changed too, because the feeling of being looked down upon was gone, and in its place was a quiet confidence that came from doing things their own way, and the cities of Earth and Mars and Luna glowed with life as workers built faster ships, stronger weapons, and larger colonies while still finding time to build parks and schools for their children, because they had learned that power meant nothing without purpose, and so they worked with balance, knowing that they were no longer second to anyone. Captain Laura Bennett. Now Admiral Bennett commanded the new Terran Defense Fleet, and her ships patrolled the edge of human space, watching for any sign of Council intrusion, and every time a small scout or merchant ship from the Council came near, they were turned away politely but firmly, and though she gave no threats, her message was always clear that human space was now sovereign and not to be crossed, and those who met her said she was calm and respectful, but there was a strength in her words that made even hardened alien captains afraid to test her patience. Daniel Cross no longer worked as an ambassador, because there was no council to speak to, but he served as one of the main advisors to the Terran Union's leadership, and he spent most of his time visiting colonies and new settlements, talking to people and helping them remember that the purpose of their independence was not revenge but growth and unity. And when people asked him if he missed the old days, he said that he missed peace, but not the kind of peace that came with chains, and that what they had now was worth the struggle. Far across the galaxy, the Council's unity was crumbling because the smaller species were starting to leave the Alliance one by one, claiming that it no longer offered protection or trade benefits, and many began to look toward the Terran Union as a new center of power. And though the humans had not reached out or offered alliances yet, their example alone was enough to inspire others to stand on their own. And this frightened the remaining council members, who realized that their influence was slipping away faster than they could rebuild it. Elias Grant tried to warn Varix again, saying that if they did not change their approach soon, the humans would become the dominant power in the galaxy, and that once that happened, no one would be able to stop them. But Varix refused to listen, calling him weak and sentimental, and accused him of being a sympathizer who still admired humans too much. And soon Elias found himself pushed aside, given small, meaningless duties far from the center of power, while the council continued its endless arguments. Meanwhile, the humans began a new project called the Gateway Initiative, which aimed to build a network of slipspace portals linking all their colonies into one connected grid, and this project was led by engineers from Earth and Luna, and the speed at which it was completed shocked even the most optimistic observers because in only 2 years, they had connected half the Terran worlds, and trade and communication between them became faster than anything the Council could match. And this new power allowed humanity to move like lightning across their territory. Admiral Bennett watched the completion of the last portal from the bridge of her flagship Unity, and she felt a deep sense of pride, because she knew this network would not just make them faster, but also safer and more united. And as she looked at the glowing gate, she thought about how far they had come since that day in the council hall, and how the words of Daniel Cross had become a promise that they had kept with every step forward and every ship launched into the dark. The council at last realized how serious the situation had become when several frontier stations reported strange signals near the edge of human space, and the readings showed energy patterns far beyond anything they understood, and the ships sent to investigate never returned. And soon rumors spread that humanity had built weapons capable of destroying entire fleets, and though there was no proof, the fear alone was enough to send waves of panic through the council worlds, and calls for negotiations began once again. Ferrex tried to regain control by ordering reconnaissance missions and threatening sanctions against any species trading with humans. But none of it worked because no one could reach Terran space, and those who tried simply vanished or returned, saying that human patrols had warned them to turn back. And even though the humans never fired a shot, the message was clear that they were not to be tested, and so the Council's threats began to sound empty. On one quiet night, Daniel Cross stood on the balcony of a research station orbiting Neptune, and he looked out at the stars where the distant lights of new colonies shone faintly, and he thought about how history would remember this moment, and he hoped it would not be seen as the time of division, but as the time humanity found itself. And when Admiral Bennett joined him, she said that the Council would soon come crawling back and ask for talks, and Daniel nodded, saying that if they did, they would listen, but only if respect came first. Far away, Elias Grant sat alone in his small office reading another report from the Rim, this one showing something that made his heart stop, because it confirmed what he had feared the most, that the humans were no longer just building stations. They were terraforming entire systems with new technology that could reshape planets in months instead of centuries. And that meant the Terran Union now had the means to build 1,000 worlds, while the Council could barely maintain the ones they had. He sent a message to the Council warning them again, but this time he did not expect a reply, and instead he sent a copy to an old friend who had left the Council to live on a human colony years ago. And in that message he wrote that maybe it was time to accept that the age of the Council was ending, and that a new order was rising built by the very people they had once insulted and ignored. And when he finished writing, he felt both sadness and relief because he knew it was true. In the months that followed, sightings of Terran exploration fleets increased as they pushed beyond the Rim into places no one had mapped before, and some of their ships even passed close to Council space. But they did not stop or communicate, they simply moved on, following paths of their own and watching from afar. Elias could not help but feel that the galaxy was slowly shifting around them like a tide that could not be stopped. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe humanity was not just surviving but leading evolution itself towards something greater. On Earth, the people no longer spoke of the Council with anger. They barely spoke of it at all because their eyes were fixed on the stars ahead, and the dreams of their children were not of politics but of discovery. And in every corner of their growing civilization, there was a sense that they had only just begun to understand what they could become, and that thought alone was stronger than any weapon and brighter than any empire that had ever existed. The galaxy was changing faster than anyone could keep track of, because the humans had not only built fleets and colonies, but had begun to spread influence through the outer rim, and every report that reached the Council caused more worry than the last, because they realized that humanity was no longer just a distant power they could ignore, but a force moving with purpose and intelligence, and one that no one had yet fully measured. On the Terran homeworlds, people spoke quietly about what they had achieved, and they no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone outside their borders, because they had proven it to themselves through the work of years and the success of their projects, and the sight of ships leaving hangars that were bigger than any Council station, or moving like living shadows through the stars, gave everyone a sense of quiet pride that was stronger than any applause. Admiral Laura Bennett stood on the bridge of her flagship Unity as it moved along a patrol route near the rim, and her crew worked calmly because they were trained well and trusted each other completely. And though they knew the Council might be watching them or sending spies, they did not fear them because they had built ships and weapons no one else could match, and they had strategies no one else had imagined, and the knowledge of that power made them patient and confident. Daniel Cross visited a newly completed colony on a planet with oceans and skies still wild, and he walked through streets filled with humans who had come to settle there, and every building and school and workshop showed the thought and care that had gone into making it a home. And as he spoke with people, he reminded them that all their work had a purpose not to conquer, but to create and to protect the chance for humanity to grow without interference. And the people nodded because they understood deeply. Far away on a council world, the delegates argued and shouted and blamed each other because none of their plans seemed to stop the humans, and the smaller species that had once obeyed or relied on them began to leave quietly, one by one, and rumors spread that some colonies were considering joining the Terran Union or at least trading with them secretly, and that possibility terrified the Council because they had built their power on the fear that no one would step away, but humanity had shown that fear could be overcome with will and unity. Commander Elias Grant watched these reports from a small observation post near the edge of known space, and he felt a strange mixture of admiration and fear because he had once served the Council faithfully and had believed in its power, but now he realized that the humans had changed the rules and that no one could stop them from becoming the strongest force in the galaxy if they wished. And even though he still loved the Council, he knew it was too late to return to the way things were. The humans began to test their new technologies in hidden areas using energy systems that no other species had ever seen, and ships capable of extreme speed moved between colonies almost instantly, and terraforming stations transformed barren planets into thriving ecosystems in months instead of years, and scientists found ways to produce food and water where there had been none. And all of it made human worlds stronger and more self-sufficient than the Council had ever imagined possible. On Earth, Daniel Cross and Admiral Bennett met in the command center of the largest shipyard and looked at the plans for the next generation of fleets and colonies, and they spoke quietly about the future and what it might hold. And Daniel said that the Council would soon realize the mistake they had made, and Laura nodded, knowing that the humans had built more than ships and stations. They had built freedom and strength, and that combination was unstoppable when used wisely. In the Council chambers, panic began to rise because reports of human expansion reached every corner, and even species that had remained loyal began to speak openly about the humans being a threat, and some suggested diplomacy, but most argued that the humans had already passed the point where words could matter, and that the only way to respond would be with force. Yet no one dared take the first step because every report said that human weapons and fleets were faster, smarter, and more advanced than anything the Council had, and that made every choice dangerous. Elias Grant continued to gather data secretly, and he learned that the humans had begun building a network of hidden colonies and research stations far beyond the known galaxy, and that each station was self-sufficient and protected by fleets that could move faster than detection systems. And when he shared this with other Council officers, they could not believe it, and many dismissed it as rumor. But he knew it was real because the measurements came from careful observation over months, and nothing could deny the truth. Meanwhile, the humans quietly developed trade and resource systems within their own borders that did not rely on anyone else, and this allowed them to continue growing while the Council debated what to do, and while outsiders feared what might happen. The humans acted as if nothing could harm them, because they had learned to depend on themselves first, and no one could stop them from reaching the stars or building new worlds for their people. On one of the outer colonies, Daniel walked through a field of young trees planted by settlers who had just arrived from Earth, and he watched children play in the light of the twin suns, and he thought about how far they had come since leaving the Council, and how all the insults and threats had only made them stronger, and he realized that humans did not need approval or permission to grow, and that truth gave him a calm he had never felt inside the Council walls. Admiral Bennett watched over a training exercise where new crews were learning to pilot ships capable of extreme maneuvers, and she saw their confidence and skill, and she knew that the future fleets would be even stronger than the current ones, and that when the time came, the humans could respond to anything the Council or any other species tried to do. And that realization gave her pride because they had achieved something no one else had even imagined possible. The council began sending messages and envoys trying to reopen contact, but none of them received answers because the humans were no longer listening to them, and instead, they focused on building and exploring and expanding quietly and efficiently, and every day their power grew, and the council realized that they had made a mistake they could not undo, and that their insults and arrogance had only created a stronger and more determined humanity. Even smaller species began to take note and started sending secret messages asking for permission to trade with humans, or to learn from them, and while the humans listened, they did not need to agree because they were strong enough to choose freely. And when Daniel Cross received one such message, he smiled and replied politely that humans would help those who acted with honesty and respect, and that the age of fear and domination was over, and that simple sentence carried more weight than all the threats the council could make. On Earth, scientists continued to push boundaries using new technology discovered in remote sectors, and engineers built massive ships capable of travel faster than any before. And while they did it quietly, they knew that the council was watching, and that the rumors of their strength would grow. And Laura Bennett continued to patrol the rim to make sure no one tested them. And she knew that peace required preparation and strength as much as words, and that balance made humans unstoppable, without even raising weapons. Daniel Cross walked on the observation deck of a colony on Mars looking at the stars beyond, and he thought about how the galaxy would remember this moment one day as the time when humans took control of their own destiny, and he realized that all the insults and mockery from the council had only made the people of Earth and its colonies stronger and smarter, and more united than ever. And that knowledge gave him confidence that whatever came next, humanity would face it together and succeed. The galaxy was no longer the same because humanity had grown quietly while the council argued and feared, and now the humans had fleets larger than anything known, and colonies scattered across the far rim and energy systems and technologies that could not be matched, and every new report that reached the council reminded them of their mistake, and the weight of it was heavy on every delegate who had once mocked them. Daniel Cross stood on the bridge of a massive Terran command ship looking at the stars, and he thought about how far they had come since the day they walked away from the council, and how simple it had been to refuse to bow, and how powerful that decision had become over the years, and he knew that the galaxy was beginning to see humans not as children or troublemakers, but as equals who would not be ignored and never again be dismissed. Admiral Laura Bennett stood beside him overseeing a training exercise where dozens of new ships moved through complex maneuvers at incredible speed, and she watched the crews work together with precision and skill, and she knew that the Terran Union had built not just ships and stations, but confidence and unity, and that combination would protect them more than any weapon ever could, and she felt a quiet pride knowing that their future was secure. Meanwhile, the council tried once more to send envoys to human space, but this time even their fastest ships never arrived, because the humans controlled the slipspace routes and the gateways connecting their colonies, and any attempt to enter was met with polite but firm refusal, and slowly the council realized that negotiation was no longer possible without respect, and that they had already pushed humanity too far, and that truth sent panic through every chamber of the alliance. Smaller species began sending messages asking for guidance and support, and though the humans responded, they did so on their own terms, and only when they saw honesty and goodwill, because humanity had learned that respect was earned, not demanded. And this careful approach made the Terran Union stronger, because it created allies, not subjects, and the message spread quietly through the galaxy that the humans were not to be underestimated, and that they had returned to the stars in their own power. On Earth, engineers continued to build enormous ships and research stations far beyond the old borders, and scientists experimented with technologies that had never existed in the galaxy before, and children learned about exploration not as a dream, but as a purpose, and as every new colony was completed and every new gateway activated, the humans proved that independence meant nothing if not combined with vision and intelligence, and that combination made them unstoppable without violence. Daniel Cross visited one of the most distant colonies on a planet with seas and mountains, and he walked among the settlers who had come to build a life there, and he saw the schools and workshops and homes, and he realized that humanity had created not just a new power, but a new way of living in the galaxy that was stronger than fear or control. and that knowledge gave him hope that no council or empire could ever take it away. Admiral Bennett piloted her fleet near a newly discovered system, where human scientists had built the first slipspace gateway connecting it to the main network, and as she watched the process, she thought about how far they had come and how quiet their growth had been, but how unstoppable it now seemed, and she realized that the humans had become a force that no one could challenge without respect, and that understanding alone could prevent war and conflict, because humanity had learned to combine strength with patience. Counselor Varix and his allies were desperate because every report of human expansion made them look smaller and weaker, and they began to argue that it was time to send fleets to force submission, but the senior officers and diplomats who still remembered the past argued that any attack would be disastrous because humans had built fleets and defenses far beyond the Council's reach, and that even one mistake could destroy years of infrastructure and influence, and in that moment the Council understood that they had underestimated humanity completely. Elias Grant, who had once been a loyal officer of the Council, now watched quietly as the humans continued their work, and he understood that the decision to leave the Council had changed everything, because it had shown the galaxy that humans would not be controlled or bullied, and that their determination combined with skill and intelligence had created something new and powerful, and that realization made him respect them deeply, even if he still grieved for the Council he had served. The Terran Union began sending small fleets to explore unknown systems beyond even the far rim, and they discovered resources and energy sources that had been hidden for millennia, and with each discovery their technology grew, and their colonies expanded, and every step showed that humanity could survive and thrive without anyone else's approval, and that the galaxy was beginning to feel that shift in power silently but completely, and no one could stop it without facing impossible consequences. Daniel Cross looked at a star map showing the spread of human colonies and fleets, and he thought about how the Council must now understand that walking away was not a threat, but a decision to claim their own future. And he smiled quietly because that moment of standing firm in the Council chamber so many years ago had created everything they now had, and he knew that humanity would never again allow itself to be diminished by arrogance or fear. On one distant planet, the children of settlers played under alien suns and learned about the stars not as a dream, but as a path, and Daniel walked among them thinking that this was the real power humanity had created. Not ships or weapons, but people, who would never be afraid to grow and explore and to shape their own future, and that realization filled him with pride, because it meant the galaxy would never forget the lesson the humans had taught. Admiral Bennett watched as new ships left the hangars on a training exercise, and she saw how each crew worked in harmony, and she knew that when the time came they could respond to any threat or challenge, and that humanity's strength did not come from anger or aggression, but from unity and preparation and respect, and she felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that the Terran Union had become something no one could ignore or control. Messages continued to reach the Council from smaller species asking for trade agreements or advice, and the humans responded carefully, choosing who to work with and when and how, and each interaction reminded the galaxy that humanity had the power to shape the future quietly and peacefully if it wished, but that any attempt to dominate them would be met with force and clever strategy. And the Council finally understood that their arrogance had created a species stronger than any they had faced. Daniel Cross stood on the observation deck of a new station in the Outer Rim, and he looked at the stars stretching infinitely and thought about the journey from the Council chamber to this moment. And he realized that humanity had not only survived, but had thrived and grown stronger because of every insult, every threat, every moment of disrespect. And he smiled quietly, knowing that the galaxy had learned what peace really meant, and that the humans had taught it without firing a shot. The Terran fleets moved through the outer systems silently but with purpose, and each colony they visited was stronger, faster, and better connected than the Council could have imagined, and every new gateway activated and every station completed was a reminder that humanity had walked away from peace talks not in anger, but in wisdom, and that wisdom had created power and respect, and the galaxy would never forget it. In the silence of space, Daniel Cross and Admiral Bennett stood together looking at the endless stars, and they knew that what they had achieved was more than victory. It was the promise of a future where humanity would never again be ignored, and that lesson would echo through generations because it was not built on fear or weapons but on courage, unity, and the choice to stand strong and independent. And in that moment, The galaxy could feel that change, even if the Council still tried to deny it. The humans had walked away from the Council, and in doing so they had walked toward their own destiny. And now the galaxy was learning the truth that power came not from control or threats, but from will, intelligence, and respect, and that humanity had become the example no one could deny, and the Council had learned too late that the mistake of arrogance could never undo the rise of a species that had decided to claim its own future.